preheat qualification requirements. Let's start with the changes to preheat qualification. In the 2020 edition, minimum preheat was generally established using the values in Table 5.8. Annex B or other recognized methods could also be used, but if you wanted to go below the tabulated minimum, you needed engineer approval along with WPS qualification testing. The 2025 edition gives us 3 clearly defined methods. We can use the applicable values from Table 5.11 or Table 6.10, calculate the minimum preheat using Annex B, or establish the minimum preheat through the WPS qualification test itself. The significant change here is Annex B. If the Annex B calculation produces a minimum preheat below the applicable tabulated value, that lower temperature can now be used for WPS qualification. So this isn't simply a reorganization of the old language. AWS has provided a clearer path for qualifying a lower minimum preheat. Minimum interpass temperature. The 2025 edition also provides much clearer requirements for minimum interpass temperature during WPS qualification. The basic rule is pretty straightforward. The minimum interpass temperature is the same as the qualified minimum preheat temperature. During welding of the qualification test plate, we cannot allow the interpass temperature to fall below that minimum. If the test plate does cool below the required preheat temperature, welding has to stop. Heat is then applied until the plate is brought back up to the minimum preheat temperature, and welding can resume. The important point is that minimum preheat isn't just something we check before striking the first arc. That minimum temperature has to be maintained throughout welding of the qualification test. Maximum interpass temperature. Now let's look at the other end of the temperature range. The 2025 edition specifically addresses maximum interpass temperature. A maximum interpass temperature has to be stated on the WPS when CVN testing is required or when the particular base material requires a maximum interpass temperature. This is important because we're controlling 2 different things. Minimum preheat establishes the low end. We don't want the material getting too cold between passes. Maximum interpass establishes the high end. We don't want excessive heat accumulation when that could adversely affect toughness or other material properties. So the 2025 edition gives us a much more complete temperature control framework during WPS qualification. Establish the minimum, maintain it during welding, and establish a maximum when the application requires one. Macroetch acceptance criteria reorganized. Next, we have the macroetch test requirements. When we compare the 2020 and 2025 editions, most of the fundamental acceptance criteria haven't really changed. What AWS has done is reorganize the requirements and make them easier to follow. The etched specimen still cannot contain cracks. We still need thorough fusion between adjacent layers of weld metal and between the weld metal and the base metal. The weld profile has to conform to the specified detail without the prohibited variations referenced in Clause 7. An undercut cannot exceed 1/32 of an inch or 1 millimeter. So don't look at this section and assume AWS created an entirely new macroetch acceptance standard. Most of what we're seeing here is clearer organization of requirements that already existed. Weld-specific macroetch requirements. There are, however, a couple of details worth pointing out in the weld-specific requirements. For a PJP groove weld, the actual weld size still has to equal or exceed the specified weld size. For fillet welds, fusion has to extend to the root of the joint, but it does not necessarily have to extend beyond the root. The 2025 edition now explicitly includes plug-and-slot welds in that root fusion requirement. That's worth noting because the 2020 language specifically addressed fillet welds. There's another interesting difference. The 2020 edition explicitly stated that the minimum fillet weld leg size had to meet the specified fillet weld size. That separate statement is no longer present in the 2025 language we're comparing here. So overall, this section has been simplified and reorganized, with plug-and-slot welds explicitly brought into the root fusion requirement.